Welcome students. This presentation is about the Sustainable Development Goals. In the following I will give you an overview of these goals which have been adopted by most countries in the world. Let's start with a brief overview of the history of the Sustainable Development Goals. Actually, the Sustainable Development Goals are only the most recent step in a long-term effort of the member states of the United Nations to shift the world onto a more sustainable development path. The formal start of these intergovernmental efforts began with the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm, in Sweden in the year 1972. That was the first global conference on the environment and development, and it first acknowledged conflicts between environment and development. At the same time, a very influential report was published with the title Limits to Growth, which was commissioned by the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome is a think tank which performs research and advocacy on the world economic system, environmental degradation and other topics. The report Limits to Growth that was published in the year 1972 was a scenario analysis of 12 possible future scenarios of the world from the year 1972 to the year 2100. It was actually a computer simulation of these possible future scenarios. One of its main conclusions was that if the growth trends in world population, industrialization, pollution, food production and resource depletion continue unchanged, that then the limits of growth on this planet will be reached sometime within the next 100 years. The report further said that the most likely consequence of reaching these limits will be an uncontrollable decline in population and industrial capacity. So it was a very pessimistic outlook for the future of our planet. In the year 1982, the General Assembly of the United Nations initiated the so-called World Commission on Environment and Development. The informal name of this commission was Brundtland Commission, named after the former Norwegian Prime Minister Brundtland, who served as the chair of the commission. The Brundtland Commission's mandate was to re-examine the critical issues of environment and development and to propose ways to deal with these issues. In the year 1987, the Brundtland Commission published its famous report, Our Common Future, which is also known as the Brundtland Report. The Brundtland Report recognized that environmental limits to economic growth exist and introduced the concept of sustainable development as a possible solution. The report was very influential because it placed environmental issues firmly on the political agenda. One of the most important achievements of the Brundtland Report was that it viewed environment and development not as two separate topics, but as one single issue. And it furthermore introduced a definition of sustainable development, which you already know from our previous class. It said that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. In 1992, the United Nations organized a conference in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, the so-called United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, which is also informally known as the Earth Summit. The governments of 172 countries participated in this conference, with 116 governments sending their heads of state or government. Furthermore, some 2,400 representatives of non-governmental organizations attended. The participants of this conference agreed to publish several documents, such as the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development and the Agenda 21. These documents are not legally binding, but they turned out to be very influential with regards to sustainable development policies. The Agenda 21, for example, is a voluntary action plan with regard to sustainable development. In the years after 1992, many countries adopted this action plan in their national environmental policies. In addition to agreeing on such voluntary action plans, the United Nations also opened important legally binding agreements for signature, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. 20 years later, in the year 2012, the United Nations organized another conference in Rio de Janeiro, the so-called United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, which is also informally known as Rio Plus 20. The leaders of 192 governments worldwide participated in this conference, and they took stock of what had been achieved by that time towards the progress to sustainable development. The major conclusions that they made were that the diagnosis made back in the year 1972 at that first UN conference was still fundamentally correct. That combining economic growth with environmental sustainability was a challenge that was not well addressed and a problem that was getting worse. And second, that the major actions that were agreed upon at the UN conference in 1992 had not been successful in the end at solving these problems. They found that there were still ongoing and unresolved problems like climate change, an ongoing loss of biodiversity, and many other environmental problems. In order to address these remaining environmental problems, Rio Plus 20 resulted in the non-binding document The Future We Want, which supports the development of Sustainable Development Goals. It's interesting to know that the Sustainable Development Goals were not the first global development goals of the United Nations. In fact, the United Nations had already developed another set of development goals in the year 2000, the so-called Millennium Development Goals.